This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is Zack Adams, joining us from Connecticut, from Fox Farm Brewery. Welcome to the podcast, Zack.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jimmy. Happy to be here.
If you've been a reader or subscriber to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, you may have seen our breakout brewer story on Fox Farm back in 2018, written by Tyler Plord. Also, there's a recipe for Quiet Life Pilsner in that issue of the magazine, so go check that out. Fox Farm is a literal farmhouse brewery in a barn behind the home that you all live in, Zack.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've been living here since mid 2013.
So we're going to dig into that kind of American farmhouse brewing tradition. We're going to dig into Fox Farm's particular focus on lagering, as well as some classic ale styles that they've recently impressed us with. We are going to dig into that kind of brewing tradition and how they've built a character for their beers, and how they've done things like, make a brown ale with no adjuncts that's scored over a 4.0 on Untapped, which I think is absolutely mind-blowing to me. But it says something for for the quality of that classic approach that the consumers and the people that are drinking your beer consider it so highly. We're going to talk about why that is, but first, as the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, reliability, and dedication to their customers' craft. New this year, redundancy meets efficiency. G&D's micro-channel condensers are built with all aluminum construction, which eliminates galvanic corrosion. Using half the refrigerant of conventional condensers with fewer brazed connections translates to a lower GWP and less opportunity for leaks. Call G&D Chillers today to discuss your project or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, Sativa, brought to you by BSG Hops Solutions. Meet the latest in the BSG Hop Solutions portfolio, Sativa. Strong expressions of stone fruit, floral, and resinous pine flavors and aromas define this blend, crafted specifically for use in hazy IPAs and other hops-forward beers. Sativa is ideal for aroma, whirlpool, and dry hop additions to hazy and juicy IPAs, or for any other hoppy styles where a combination of citrus, tropical fruit, and pine aromatics are desired. Go to bsgcraftbrewing.com and learn more, or call 1-800-374-2739. So, Zack, let's walk back a little bit through your brewing history. Certainly, the breakout brewer story is there if people want, the 1,500-word background on Fox Farm. But walk me through what were the key moments that got you into craft beer and then set you on this path to be a brewer, and what did you do before Fox Farm?
Sure. I was pretty fortunate to have some exposure to good beer with a slight international slant at kind of a younger age. One of my first friends, freshman year of college, still a good friend of mine to this day, was from Munich. And so we'd go on these journeys around Boston with our fake IDs, trying to track down Augustiner and Franziskaner and just like scooping up whatever beers from home that we could find that he wanted to share with us. So between that, a trip to Germany with him, and a year in college spent in London, I just fell in love with traditional European styles. And as much as that, the cultures that support those beers. So that cultural element has proven to be just a really big influence in how we approach brewing and hospitality here at Fox Farm. I was also lucky enough to have a wonderful girlfriend, now my wife Laura, who came from an Italian family with this multi-generational tradition and love affair of winemaking, home winemaking. It's not uncommon in the Northeast by any means, but they're a bit deeper into it than most. That they had several acres of grapes planted, actually just down the road from what is now the brewery. So that was a big gravitational pull to this area and an influence as well. They were the ones that gave me my first homebrew kit. I was at graduation from college in 2009, and a very common story from there. Became absolutely obsessed, particularly with trying to nail classic styles as best I could. Kind of had this mindset of, who am I to innovate and branch out and try these, wild experimental brews that were so popular, in 2009, 2010. I wanted to learn how to kind of walk first, and never really busted out of that really. Um, After a few years, the beer was getting decent enough. Started having a little luck in competition and such, but I didn't think seriously about starting a brewery at all. I just didn't have the confidence of like contributing anything to the New England beer scene, which, even back 2010, 2011, 2012, it was coming into its own in a really impressive way. And
Sure.
it would, looking back, the opinion doesn't age well that it was a crowded space, but it certainly felt like, there was a lot going on to be excited about, and to be able to contribute something to that would require quite a bit, in my opinion. Um, the thinking started to shift around the same time that we found this place that we're in now. So it's right down the street from my in-laws' vineyard, and it's this old dairy farm, pretty unique by New England dairy farm standards. Rather small plot of land, smaller pasture area, big beautiful barn, actually put up in the '60s. Most dairy farms around New England, kind of crumbling, um,
Right.
1800 build. So very unique, but it had been vacant for 30 plus years. I should provide some reference. We're in Salem, Connecticut, which is on the eastern half of the state, which is a bit more rural than what most people think of when they think of, the crowded state of Connecticut. Um,
Yeah, Connecticut is very populous down on the waterfront, and then there's those patches in the northwest and the northeast corners that just are full on rural.
yeah, yep, and that was a big part of our thinking as we're trying to crystallize our thoughts around this, and that, we did have this kind of rural feel to the place, so, authentic, ruralness, but at the same time, striking distance to some densely populated centers, where it wasn't a huge leap of faith to kind of put out there that we'd like to create a place that folks could come visit on a, short 30-40 minute drive, and enjoy themselves. It's compared to some of our contemporaries in New England, that's actually, pretty convenient.
Sure, sure. And so, is Fox Farm your first commercial brewing experience then?
It is, yeah. That was another huge part of it, getting over that hump. And it's not an unusual story by any means, but it took a long time, even after this space. We actually moved here prior to anything kind of, setting up in a concrete way for the brewery, with the hopes of it happening. But it took another 4 years of kind of spinning our wheels and getting comfortable with the idea of making a go at things.
Sure, and then spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on renovation, equipment, and everything, and making it into a business.
Oh yeah.
You know, as you did decide to take that leap, and then made that jump from home brewing into pro brewing, what were some of the biggest things and the biggest challenges that you'd faced along that route?
There was we had the grace of like this long run up for me to really sink my teeth in as best you could, through literature and other forms of learning. We went through a zoning process that involved about 7 months of just public hearings, just folks
Oof,
kind of standing up, speaking their
right.
mind. Tack on another couple months on either end of that of just, general run-ups in the zoning process, the build-out process. It was a good 2 years of me kind of learning the way I had learned as a home brewer by just trying to gobble up any information that I could track down, which fortunately, and in today's age, there's a lot of information out there. But once the equipment kind of landed on our doorstep, then that's when, the rubber met the road. But fortunately, we were able to get through things with minimal hiccups, and the first batches coming out were something that we could feel proud about.
That's great. And so you've never brewed on a commercial system before. You've got this focus on brewing more traditional styles of beer because that's the background and experience and the thing that gets you excited about it. yeah, that had to be a challenge then getting into brand new equipment, brewing at that kind of scale, and then also trying to hit some very exacting styles of beer through that. Talk to me about some of those early brews and some of that initial process of learning.
Yeah, so our first beer through the system was actually Gather, our German style pills, and
Your
um,
first beer was a Pilsner? Your
first
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 commercial
beer,
brew? Oh,
first
okay.
commercial brew
Yeah.
was a Pilsner.
Oh,
Yeah,
hey,
really went first there. Um,
start with the easy one. I mean, come on.
well, we had to get in the tanks if we wanted to come
Yeah.
out and really put our flag in the ground and say these are the beers we care about. Um, the lager beer had to be the first one because that's going to take the most time. Um, but we've always been a brewery that we go for things and do so with a certain level of comfort in the understanding of our process. At that time, our process was under development, obviously, but and a deep understanding of our ingredients and knowing how those things are going to interact, and hopefully, have a reasonable degree of confidence that we're gonna come close to the mark that we're achieving, and then from there, it's just never ending iteration, fine tuning and tweaking. And fortunately, that first batch of Gather and those that followed set us down a path that we felt really good with, but have never really wavered from that tweaking and constant iteration.
Let's talk a little bit more about that kind of initial creation focus, some of that ingredient, and then that kind of way that that triangulates into process around your lagers. Before we do that, the most common complaint about hard seltzers: they need more flavor. Extract alone is a weak flavoring agent and can leave a chemical aftertaste, but there is a better way. The craft concentrate blends from Old Orchard are packed with real fruit first, no added sugars, and just enough natural flavor. Breweries are turning to Old Orchard concentrates for seltzer with more body, color, and aroma. Turn seltzer skeptics into supporters with seltzer that drinks like a beer. Get started at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, for years, Brewery DB has been the industry's only professionally curated source of brewery and beer information. In 2019, over 1 million taproom visits were made by craft fans searching for breweries on brewerydb.com. In early 2021, Brewery DB will unveil an all-new experience to help craft lovers get back to the brewery trail. To take full advantage of the enhanced marketing power of Brewery DB and to increase your taproom traffic, visit marketmybrewery.com. That's marketmybrewery.com. It's easy and it's free. So, Zach, as you decide to launch this brewery with a lager focus or significant lager focus, obviously you make IPAs and farmhouse ales and wine beer hybrids and everything else too. But with this hefty focus on lagers and knowing that there is such a tradition and an expectation around them, talk to me about thinking about designing this German Pilsner, how you made some ingredient selections, and then how that ended up translating into brewing process.
Sure. Yeah, we use 90% Wireman malt in our lager beer, and that's mostly a product of just being comfortable with their malts.
Sure.
And having been to Wireman and brewed with their stuff on the homebrew scale, and now for several years on the commercial level, just knowing exactly what we're getting across their whole line of malts, we feel very, very, very good about. Yeast selection was something that I had gone into starting Fox Farm with this home brewing background. The yeast that we actually use here is not available on the homebrew scale. It's Augustiner's lager yeast, available through BSI, um, and that was a bit of a leap of faith to bring that into the brewery. But also having a deep love and admiration for their beers gave us a certain level of comfort, and finding the fermentation profile that we wanted for that yeast, with a little bit of guidance from those that were familiar with it was good. But we still had to kind of find how it behaves in our brewery, and I think a lot of what we
Talk to
do.
me more about that. I'm curious. What was that process of finding how it works in your brewery?
Sure. We initially just started experimenting with those key variables of knockout temperature, when we were going to go into our rest, how long we were going to hold our rest, and how fast we were going to crash. So just kind of drilling down, exactly how cold could we go with this thing, and one of the key things really has been identifying when we want to start our rest. There's almost a seasonality to it. If the brewery's a little chilly, taking things down to like below 6 Plato and still getting up to that diacetyl rest temperature we're looking for can be pretty challenging. And then just kind of fine tuning those details over time. We got very comfortable with it now, but trying to kind of taste through every single batch in those first 2 years and figure out what we could do better was certainly a learning experience.
And it was really, most of it came down to time and temperature for you on that. That's really interesting. I hadn't
Exactly.
thought about the kind of environmental concern of ambient temperature in the brewery affecting how it might
Yeah.
adjust your fermentation profile or the
Uh,
speed that something might be able to rise.
yeah, we are a heated space, but a drafty old dairy barn in New England is a little tough to heat, so it's a consideration. And we're not cooled in the summer months, so we have all the room in the world to get up to 60 degrees, but it's just a matter of timing it right. And I've spoken with plenty of brewers that love experimenting with different lager strains of brewery origins, country of origin, and using that to um, present a certain variety in their lineup. But we've taken the tact of having a deep understanding of our yeast and playing with other variables to kind of color those differences between different lager styles in a meaningful way, but still kind of playing within the bounds that we are comfortable with and that we feel is really important for like a technically sound lager. That fermentation is number one.
It seems to be the key of lager brewing that it is as much about constant focus and deep knowledge in order to find and tweak those minuscule parameters along the way. For you, as you're going through those first 2 years of brewing Pilsner and learning the ins and outs of fermentation, um, can you think back to those early days and how you might describe the sensory change? I mean, over those 2 years, what would you describe? Now clearly you're happy with the beer, but you thought it could be a little bit better, and in small kinds of ways. Describe to me, for somebody who is trying to also learn better about how to parse out those minute differences. For you, what were those small things that you were looking to adjust?
It's on a sensory level, it was looking for certain cleanliness in the final product. Um, Letting the yeast, it's slightly expressive. It can have a slight little sulfur tinge to it. Keeping that in check by not letting things kind of run too hot too fast, and then taking our time, patience, being key. Um, we were just finding the beers when we crashed them a little too fast could get a little kind of clunky and rough around the edges and didn't have this certain concise, you know bright clean characteristic to them. We don't have this robust sensory program. We have three of us in production working full time, and a great retail staff that includes M Souter, who is
Sure.
pursuing her master's cicerone, and she's great for helping us pick up on what we might be tasting. But we kind of have to put our heads together, as few as they may be, to kind of try and understand what might need to be tightened up. But in general, patience has been the biggest virtue, and something we've kind of drawn out. So all of our loggers are on this 8 to 10 week schedule, with a very slow crash, a pretty cool ferment right around 50 degrees. So we're taking our time.
I want to come back and talk to you about mash regimen, but when you mention tasting in a small brewery, I am also curious about that. You mentioned you don't have a tasting panel. It's not like you can go to a room where samples are pushed through a little window onto your desk. And daily you've got folks sampling these kinds of things. For you all, how do you go through that process of evaluation? Is it just an informal tasting things off tap, or do you have a more kind of developed process to where you evaluate together or separately and then compare notes?
Uh, we do it very informally. kind of huddled around the bar, whether it's during lunch breaks
Sure, sure.
or in the evenings. But everyone here has thick skin, and is able to deliver sharp criticism where needed. And I've always been very open to that, letting folks, whether from production or retail, let us know what they're tasting, because not everyone tastes everything the same exact way. We might have a super taster for diacetyl where I'm just partially sensitive to it. So it's just something that's built into the culture of the brewery, where anyone at any time feels a certain degree of comfort voicing any concerns, or just how something might be improved. Um, that's at this point more often than anything else is just, hey, I really liked what we did with this um, batch of a new IPA, but I think we could steer it in this different direction if we play with the top notes on the hopping as opposed to just those deep dark fruit notes.
Sure, sure. No, and in fact, over the last 7 years of judging beer with Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, with a myriad of different judges, I can agree with you on that. Like, it's amazing the range in palates and how different people taste things differently, what people are sensitive to, what they're not sensitive to, and it's only through that process of time and understanding and reflection that you start to even understand your own, differences in taste. Like, I am hypersensitive to oxidation, but I don't sense diacetyl, to that same kind of degree. And so I know, yeah, even the way that I will end up describing something will be different than, some of our judges. And, and it's fascinating when you get a beer in, you find judges 10 or 12 or 15 points apart on an individual beer. You're like, the palate is an amazing thing. But let's back up a little bit and talk about mash regimen. Obviously, if you're brewing lagers, that mash process can be a pretty important piece of the overall equation. For you, what does that look like? And this is my Joe Stang question for you because because he's
I
singularly focused on the issue of decoction.
I would ask Joe if we could send him some beer blind and see if he can tell if we're decocted or not. I don't have strong feelings about decoction,
Yeah.
and that's probably just coming from someone that's never decocted lagers. Um, you know, feel comfortable with the malt character we're able to coax out of our pale lagers, despite not having a decoction regimen. But then again, we really value tradition, even where tradition doesn't necessarily translate into a really bright in your face character in the beer that you could pick out. So those that are doing decoction brewing, we tip our hats to them, and um, we admire their beers quite often, but we're happy with their single infusion mashing.
No judgment on that. Are there some malt choices that you tend to make in order to add a little more tooth, to some of your pale lagers, that might otherwise be added to that? Because when I taste them, I mean, they aren't just hyper sharp, super thin beers. Like, there's a definitely a toothiness to the beers that you make, and so I'm just curious how you build that character into them.
Yeah, I think you know a, a lot of that we have to thank our maltster. Wireman does a great job, and we also use Stone Path malt from Massachusetts, who's got a special relationship with Eric's in Germany. So between those two, we love the product that they're able to provide us with, um, and we find that there's character that translates even with the palest and lightest of our lagers. But um, for something kind of traveling down the spectrum a little bit, Foon is our Franconian Keller beer. That's a beer that's a great example of constant iteration, especially over the first 3 or 4 batches. We were a little heavy-handed trying to drive some of those malt qualities that you might find in a double decocted Keller beer, and just had a heavy hand on melanoid and malt that we had to rein in along with Munich.
Yeah.
Not that it was totally out of spec for Keller beer. It's a poorly defined style that can take a number of different forms, but our target for a classic Bomberg, Keller beer, it needed to be a little more palatable, and bringing that in was part of it. So.
Are there are you boiling longer in order to kind of reduce these a little bit, or is this just standard 60 or 90 minute boils?
90 minutes across the board on lager. It's just kind of part of our
Yeah,
process. And, um, something that maybe as we venture away from pale lager isn't quite as necessary. And we're not even sure if, DMS would pop into those beers on us if we only boiled for 60 minutes. But 90 minutes is how they've been designed. And those
yeah,
days are usually light enough where extending the boil 30 minutes is something we're more than comfortable with. There's a little, flair of when we turn on the jackets as we're loudering to how that might give us a little hint of caramelization. If we're, our first jacket in the kettle is just the base of the kettle. If we're throwing that on when it's only half covered, maybe we'll get a little melanoid formation. And same thing as we start to go up the second jacket, timing, when we turn that on. But that's a hard variable to really to teach and to fine tune, but just something we play with.
sure, sure. Let's talk a little bit about hops choices. Especially in Pilsner, hops are a pretty key portion of that. For you, what's the ingredient source look like, and how do you lean? Why have you made the decisions you've made around those?
Sure. Well, it's easy with our Czech Pilsner, all Saaz. And then trying to, we're not big enough and we haven't forged the relationships for selection internationally. So trying to find the suppliers that we really trust for their Saaz, and especially over the past 2 to 3 years, it's been a little variable with what's coming from Czech. So and then on the German side, we probably have 6 German hops in our repertoire, if you will, that we pull from as we're designing recipes, and just having a deep understanding of what role they're going to play. Something like Saphir having that really bright kind of dynamic quality um, is something we use sparingly, but just to know exactly how that's going to perform in the beer. Um, yeah,
What are your so you've got Saphir. What are your other five? I'm just curious. I mean, this is like an artist with certain paints in their palette. I'm curious what those are and how you think about how you blend each one of those to achieve something a little bit different.
sure. Magnum is our go-to bittering hop
Sure.
across pretty much all these beers. Um, Spalt Select, we love it's characterful, but we tend to use that kind of mid to late boil. Um, on kind of a whirlpool edition, we haven't been too enthused about what we taste there, but we as long as we're getting 15 to 30 minutes of isomerization, we really like kind of the smooth bitterness that's provided. Hallertau Mittelfru, it's definitely in there, and that pretty much covers our range. Yeah.
Are there specific techniques that you used, or is it just down to individual hops selection as, for that quality of smooth bitterness? I mean, I think that is one of those defining factors, especially in German style lagers, where having a firm bitterness, but one with a very gentle onset, where it rolls in rather than attacking in a kind of rough or ragged type of way, is certainly the defining factor, but in quality of that kind of hops character. For you, what are some of the how does that happen for you?
Uh, the first wort hopping thing is something we've definitely employed, but haven't really um, formed a really strong opinion on whether or not that's going to drive a smoother bitterness. Um, I think the 90-minute boil with kind of a lighter hands on that early charge is the tack that we typically design recipes around. Um, and of course, using Magnum is gonna keep the vegetal matter to a minimum with its high alpha. Um, so yeah, something high alpha, trying to kind of just lay a simple base of bitterness early in the boil, and letting those noble hops really kind of shine on the later side.
Sure, sure. Are there any specific lager styles that you found yourself pushing into outside of your standard Czech and German pills, or even the Franconian Keller beer, that have helped, kind of push you as a brewer to learn and try new things?
Yeah, the cadence of our kind of lager program started with the German pills, and we introduced probably a new lager every 6 months as we continue to process what's going on and get more and more comfortable with things. Um, Czech pills being kind of the next step. It took us 18 months or more before we introduced our Hellas. Um, at this point, I feel pretty comfortable with the breadth of our lager offering. But a lot of that's kind of in flux. What inspires us, after trip to Bamberg almost 2 years ago, feeling the itch to bring Rauch beer to Salem and see if folks would respond to it was something we felt strongly about. So really looking forward to getting to travel once again and feed off that inspiration of German and Czech beer again.
So Rauch beer, and you do have a smoked Helles that you sent to us a couple of months ago for the classics issue. Um, Talk to me about brewing smoked beer and bringing smoked, which because it's a very polarizing subject for American breweries, and
Sure.
there are consumers that love it, and then there are a lot of consumers that think that they hate it. And I'll
Yeah.
say think that they hate it because most, when they actually drink it, may take a little different approach and realize that has a very common flavor, especially anybody that enjoys barbecue can instantly understand. And my God, if you drink Scotch, then you're well past anything in the
Yeah.
smoke beer range in terms of appreciation for those kinds of flavors. But it's something that people think that they don't like, regardless. For
Yeah.
you, how'd you go about creating a smoked or creating smoked lagers that could actually resonate with drinkers?
Yeah, that raises a good point, and kind of something I wasn't quite hitting on is just that progression of our lager program was as much us kind of introducing the world of lager beer to our audience as it was us learning and growing as brewers. Um, so each opportunity or each beer that we would put out there was another opportunity to tell people why we love these beers, why they matter, why they've dominated um, beer the world over for 200 years, and and you can kind of see a microcosm of that in with those two smoke lagers. We had the cabin or pale smoked Helles out for probably about a year and a half before we introduced the camp. It's fully smoked rock beer, Baumbergen style rock beer, and I think just kind of you know slowly turning those wheels in this IPA driven world, and we do brew pale ales, IPAs, and double IPAs. We're proud of those beers. But we give special love to classic styles. When we have two beers side by side, and one comes from the hop world, and one comes from a lager world, then we're gonna really shine the light bright on that lager and what that means to us and what that means to beer in general. And folks respond to it. The fact that we've been doing that since day one, we've kind of cultivated this audience that wants to learn and wants to have these styles, and 4 years in, um, they're fans of those beers, and that's been great to turn people on to new beers kind of slowly but surely.
It is kind of that thing that if you're going to do something out of the usual or out of the ordinary, you have to do it really well, and then you have to communicate that same kind of thing to your audience so that they understand it. But then you also then have something that other breweries aren't willing to take the same kind of risk on. There are those people that when they love something, they love it, and then they
Yes.
become your fans for life because you're the giving it to them.
Yeah, and putting them in that place of you know after going to Bamberg and seeing how smoke beer is consumed there, it's like, oh my god, anybody can appreciate this. When you have
Right.
20-year-old kids pounding half liters of Schlenkerla on the street, it's like, wow, there's an audience for this. I think folks can respond to it, and it's just painting it in the right light, and explaining also, you do have to get past maybe that initial shock that you feel. Get halfway through your beer before you form a strong opinion about it, and that's been really useful. Having the medium of social media, and now selling
Right.
95% of our beer through our website. having a method of communicating before something's just kind of thrust in front of somebody.
Sure, sure. I want to talk a little bit about building balance, especially in smoked beers on the lighter side. Before we do that, ABS Commercial is excited to be a part of today's podcast. ABS is a full brewery outfitter offering brew houses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts. As a part of ABS Commercial's ongoing give back campaign, they'll be giving away an ABS Keg Viking keg washer this June. So make sure to periodically check the ABS Commercial Facebook page and find out when the contest opens up and how you can enter to win a keg Viking. With something like a Helles, adding a smoked component to that becomes, it's the chance of failure is really high at that point in terms of upsetting balance. Talk to me a little bit about how you think about building that balance in such a light smoked beer.
Yeah, so it does deviate a little bit from our clean, non-smoked Helles, in that we do use a bit more dextromalt, a little more carafoam than we would in the Helles. But yeah, you do run that
Just to have a
risk.
touch of little residual sweetness that helps offset some of the smoke or some
Exactly.
of the
Try
phenolic
and
character. Yeah,
give it a little more body and highlight the malt character that that smoked malt is going to want to kind of steer things towards this slightly acrid, astringency, it's perceived acidity kind of value to it. So yeah, we're playing with our water profile a little bit as well to try and kind of beef up our pH throughout the hot side in the brew house, and um, going back to having this kind of understanding of our lager yeast, we feel like we kind of developed a really uh, firm control over how it attenuates. Just pulling that common leather, especially single infusion mashing, can be pretty easy for us in our brew house to hit a really kind of fine tuned target, and we find our yeast responds really well to it. We're able to kind of nail attenuation down within zero point 0.2 degrees Plato, and turning that dial as needed to color the difference between different beers. Where we might be happy with our Helles at like 2.3, 2.4 finishing, we might want the cabin to finish around like 2.6, just to give the impression of a little more body that smoked malt might be wanting to take away from.
are there specific smoked malts that you find yourself attracted to?
Uh, just the classic Wireman beach smoke malt. We brought in oak smoke for the first time to play with in another beer, and we'll revisit that and maybe kind of explore some different styles that I would use oak smoked wheat. But for now, just classic Wireman beach smoke barley.
Sure, sure. Let's talk about ales. We've been talking a lot about lagers here, but ales and specifically, kind of classic low ABV, ale styles are another kind of a pillar of what you do. I'd love to talk about wine beer hybrids. Obviously, with your wife's family's background in a vineyard down the road from you, I think we can talk about that a little bit after. But first, I really would love to kind of pick your brain about some of the kind of classic ale styles that you brew and what was the genesis of that inspiration.
Sure. Yeah, it took a few years to work up the nerve to kind of go down the path of uh, English styles. That being a first love, I would brew, clones of London Pride and Fuller's ESB over and over, just trying to nail those beers and to be able to go back and revisit them, 5 years later, and feel like we had an audience that might respond to those beers, which, in this climate, English styles are probably one of the hardest beers to put out there and trying to get folks to respond to. So we started with a dark mild.
Why do you think that is?
I wonder if there's a clash because there is expressive hop character across a lot of those beers, and maybe just American palates not being able to process the tea like grassy herbal, like when we've been programmed for for fruit and citrus, and um, I'm not really sure, but it's a big part of my progression as a drinker, and I think it was for a lot of people as well. So the hope is that people will kind of come back around in a way and start to see what they offer, and then also you just put them side by side. Intensity is not there. Their beers along a similar path, but are much more simple and nuanced.
We even see it amongst brewers themselves that in episodes here, even of the podcast, where we'll talk about cask ales and English style ales, they don't they don't get as many downloads, they don't do as well, like, and so it's not even just consumers, it's all brewers, by extension.
Yeah.
And I'm just fascinated by that because I absolutely love sitting down and having a properly made cask ale from and there's a few dozen breweries in the United States that do those really really well. But having those those beers, it's wonderful to have that a part of our broader world of possibility here in American craft beer. It's just fascinating to me that that they don't resonate as much. So talk to me about how you decided to build a program around that, and how you went about making beers that you found were compelling to your audience.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we haven't been able to share those beers in the way we envisioned sharing them, and but a lot of what we do here, centers around our environment and hospitality. We're in a rural location. Everyone's driving to see us, and a lot of those folks are driving a good distance, and so offering sessionable beers and our lineup. To a greater degree of anything above 7% has always been a big part of what we do, and we thought that English styles would play a great role in that. Lagers, kind of cultivating this environment or playing a role in it. English ales and pub culture, would translate in a similar way. Uh, Unfortunately, that didn't come to bear, but we weren't going to kind of forfeit the plans of rolling out a few different beers.
I mean, forfeit the
Fortunately,
plans over this past year just because you can't serve them directly on
exactly.
draft,
Yep.
to your tap room audience because you are to go only and have been for
Yeah, and featuring those either on a gravity cask or a beer engine was something that we were hopeful on, and obviously couldn't do, but um, had to go into the bag of tricks in a way to with our dark milds. We thought it was really important to smooth it out somehow. So actually, nitrogenated that first batch that went into cans, and explained to people this is why we did this. Isn't traditional,
yeah.
but there is some tradition here, and that nitrogenated beer was invented to kind of emulate cask ale, and also stylistically having not just a gimmick of nitrogenating a beer, but having it play to that style in an important way. And dark mild 3.8%. We needed to give it some body and some heft, and without overdoing the carbonation as well. Um,
How does a brewery your size nitrogenate beer? There's certainly at a larger scale, brewery like Left Hand, that does a nitro milk stout, has some pretty expensive and involved equipment, and can get beer to a very cold temperature in order to kind of promote that kind of integration of nitrogen into the beer because it wants to break out as soon as it can.
yeah.
How do you all, I'm at that scale, certainly are not investing huge amounts of money into building systems like that, and I imagine inline nitrogenators and whatnot are also out of the capital investment question. So for you, how do you do that on your smaller scale?
Yeah, we were just lucky enough, where our mobile canning operator has an inline nitro doser, and had gotten comfortable with it to the point, where we were ready to roll out these styles where they were getting good enough at it, where they could get the cascade effects, DO levels being in line with where they should be, and and kind of having the confluence of those events. Okay, they're good enough. We're ready for these beers. Let's do it. And um, so, yeah. have to
Hey,
tip
so there
tip a
you
cap to them. Yeah.
go. How does it differ when you prepare a beer to be nitrogenated? Or it, is it going in, through that process entirely flat before? Is there some CO2 in solution before you run it through that kind of inline process? How does that differ from a normal beer process?
Yeah, we're hardly the source on this stuff in that it's just our
Okay.
little dark mile that we do a couple
Oh,
times a
sorry to
year.
put
But
you on the spot. Oh, we've actually never talked about that on the podcast, so I
yeah,
got to take the opportunity.
no, uh, we want to carb fairly low. Otherwise, if it's carb too highly, that liquid nitrogen is just going to bounce off the foam
Yeah,
as it's trying to dose in prior to the steamer. So, uh, getting our beer conditions just right, I think we carb typically to 1.8 volumes. Um, that's on our Anton Par, which reads a little bit lower. So we'll call 1.8 to 2 volumes, which is rather low, but kind of required for the doser to operate at what it's
sure.
intended to, but also suitable for the style. We would never want a
Yeah.
nitro dosing lager that's carved up to 2.5 and just have it bounce off. So um, yeah, matching the beer and beer conditions with what's required for that doser to do its job properly.
And I get, is there another temperature concern too, going into that canning line? I mean, certainly with all kind of mobile canning, keeping everything cold and
Yeah.
dialing in foam, is an important piece of that. And the longer your lines are, the longer your hoses are, the more things warm up along the way.
Yeah.
Is there a technical challenge around that too?
Slightly. The beer conditions would be far from ideal if you were running on a normal canning day. So trying to limit the foam um, such that you get somewhat decent DO, but at the same time, the nitro doser can do its job. Requires us to get the beer colder. So we if we were normally canning that beer without nitrogen, we would warm it up quite a bit to try and coax some foam out of it. So in this case, it's a little cooler. The biggest downside is I will say our DO is not in line with our usual target. It is higher than normal. It's acceptable, and we also kind of swallowed a little bit in that it is an English style dark mild. This might be served at a pub and um,
If
dispense
you
through
get
a
it on
beer
cask
engine.
on day 3 or day 4, it's going to be
Yeah,
oxidized any day anyway, right?
exactly. So a little bit, and we're
Right.
keeping it cold and small batch. Hopefully, our consumers are drinking in short order, but it's not so high where we can we're uncomfortable about it. But it was a consideration. Okay, a dark mild can stand up to something that's a bit higher than our usual standards.
Sorry for putting you on the spot around a style that you don't brew a whole bunch on.
That's all right. I
Let's
like we. That's what we do is we spend much more time on these styles that might represent a smaller piece of our or percentage of our output, but that we care a lot about. And the other prong that we haven't hit on, so lagers, classic ales. We've brought in a Cole strain and have now added an alt beer to the lineup along with our Kolsch and um, farmhouse ales has from day one been a huge part of what we do. And another kind of piece of the puzzle that we feel like we have to offer that not necessarily every brewery in our region is putting out there. So
Well, let's talk about that then. Clearly you are actually in a farm, in a former dairy farm, and as you mentioned, you are right down the road from your in-laws' vineyard, and so there's you're in the midst of an agricultural area with agricultural tradition. Where did you find influence and kind of creative inspiration for the styles of farmhouse ales that you all have decided to make, and what kind of drove that piece of the puzzle?
yeah, our I think mostly revolves around our mixed culture. So we're not making clean single strain saisons, kind of the more modern interpretation with mixed culture fermented, and we prefer to use the term as a result farmhouse ales. Um, it revolves around our culture, which developed, back from the home brewing days. There's a couple strains of Zack in there, and then things kind of went off the rails a little bit with some other introductions. Some lactic acid producing bacteria made its way into the fold, and at this point, it evolved over a number of years. It's banked with the supplier. We only call in pitches maybe once or twice a year, and otherwise let it do its thing and have realized minimal drift as a result. So um, everything starts with there. It can drive pretty profound acidity if that's what we intend, or somehow take our eyes off the ball and happens unintentionally, which at this point we feel like we have a really really good grasp on it. It's very sensitive culture to hopping rates, and that's our biggest lever we pull with trying to drive the fermentation character anyway, and especially fine tuning our acid levels in farmhouse ale. Um, we use pretty much all local malt across those beers, um, since that really has kind of become our greatest playground. Right, we
Yeah.
have these kind of strict traditional parameters we're playing under with some of those styles we were talking about before. We definitely scratch our creative itches when it comes to our farmhouse ale program. So um, getting a chance to use local maltsters, new to us maltsters, and getting creative with our ingredients. Finally, going out foraging local fruits when we can find them, which can be tough in southern New England. A little easier as you kind of draw out the radius, but um, yeah, that's a program that we care deeply about. And then uh, what you were touching on, beer wine hybrids, something we're excited to explore deeper in the future. For now, it's kind of in the realm of a couple beers, one of which in our farmhouse ale program called Anata. It's our annual grape harvest farmhouse ale, where we pick the grapes down the road, bring them back to the brewery, process them on site, crush, destem, and then introduce to the beer a little further down the road after we kind of wrap our heads around things, kind of see what the harvest brought us as far as the acidity of the grape, the sugar content of the grape, character of the grape, and we'll actually freeze those grapes and then introduce them to the beer later on in the year. Very excited with our spontaneous program that we've been working on since day one. It was our first piece of equipment to come into the brew. It was our cool ship. Um, finally being productive, hopefully in this coming year, and we think wine grapes will be a big part of the story we have to tell there. But
Interesting. So I want to, you've just torn through a whole bunch of stuff right there. And now I want to rewind and kind of dive into some of it a little more deeply. Looking at the farmhouse ales that you all brew, obviously it's driven by your mixed culture. Was the way that you initially pushed your mixed culture driven by a goal of flavor that you wanted to evoke, or did it go the other direction where you were trying to build a mixed culture that spoke to something and ended up building beers around what that culture told you it was going to be? I think there are definitely those different approaches that brewers can take in terms of wanting to steer it in a direction versus having and trying to have it coax out an expression of where you are, and balancing between those two things can be an interesting question for you all. How did that fall?
yeah, not uh, to kind of flip flop on it, but I guess a little of each. In that, I mentioned that I'm not 100% sure what's in this culture. I have
Sure,
a
sure.
decent idea
who
what's in
who
there,
is
and yeah, one component of it actually was a, a two-part culture blends coming from a commercial supplier that supposedly didn't have any lactic acid producing component, and was clearly lactic, and even had like some behavior that made you think, well, maybe there's some PDO in here, but it made a wonderful beer. And so it kind of stayed in the mix. And when you take that approach of you know playing with dregs and these kind of uncertainties, you're along for the ride to a certain degree. But having something in mind, like what we wanted to be able to have the opportunity to really coax classic, expressive saison yeast out of this culture, uh, if the beer needed it. So like our table beer, Pebble, is a good example of that. It's rather hoppy. Suddenly, the acid producing component kind of fades into the background, and we're able to let that stand out as what someone might interpret as a nearly clean saison. The tartness is quite low. So that was a big part of what we wanted to achieve. We always wanted the acidity to be clean, kind of a lemony funk. We didn't want to play in the realm of like real intense barnyard qualities or anything like that. We just wanted, where the beer demanded it to have this kind of clean, lemon quality.
Yeah, no, and we've just finished and sent off to the press our yearly issue with saison and farmhouse beers on it, and it has been interesting going through that tasting process with some beers where you are wondering like this is a mixed culture beer. Is it, or is this just, and I love that the days of us tasting those beers and being able to know immediately, what the process was behind it are starting to go away as folks grow more nuanced in kind of adjusting those parameters where it could be, or maybe this is just an open fermented sack strain that has its own peculiar characteristics also, which, can create the same kind of thing. But I love that it is more about the act of creation and brewing something that's interesting rather than hitting technical notes for those of us who get wonky about this to pull apart and instantly try to understand, and that kind of creating a thing that isn't just a sum of its technical parts, I think, is the most interesting thing about that kind of saison approach. So you mentioned using local grains. Now that there are craft maltsters out there all over the United States, that's more possible, for breweries of your size to work with local folks. Talk to me a little bit about building and using alternative grains or locally grown grains, and some of the learning process that you've had to go through around finding out how those work in your brew house.
Yeah, we've been pretty lucky. It's not a far drive. It's on Connecticut, but Valley Malt, started by Andrea and Christian up in Hadley, Mass, is the first small maltster on the eastern half of the United States since Prohibition, and they're about an hour 15 minutes from here.
Yeah.
And they've really been a big part of sparking, this small craft malting movement. And I was, knocking on their door as a home brewer, to buy a bag here and there, or joining their malt of the month club. And actually, since we started, I think it was a year after we got going, Connecticut got our first malt house with Thrall Family Malt, started by a multi generational farming family up in Windsor, Connecticut. They've been farming since the 1600s continuously, and really made a name for themselves as tobacco farmers. As folks in the area might be aware, Connecticut broadleaf tobacco experienced quite a boom going back, but it's in recent decades has kind of wavered as that crop has been shipped out more and more. And Spencer and his team have pivoted to a certain degree and hedged by starting to malt the barley that they've always been growing as this rotational crop. So he's kind of coming at it from the opposite angle as Andrea, farmer turned maltster. And I believe actually Valley Malt's got some stuff in the works to start growing their own barley. And to see their approaches and know what they each do very well, and where they're growing as maltsters has been fun to watch. But Spencer's been particularly like flexible, not only being brand new to it, but um, also having the capacity to put stuff in the ground based on input coming from, Connecticut brewers and now beyond, where he puts, spelt in the ground. If we say we might brew more with it next year, we haven't brought in emmer, but that's something that he's growing that we see brewers utilizing across the Northeast, knowing that, he's kind of the emmer guy. And then pretty much all of our base malt across the board. He's gotten very technically sound where we at least have a good degree of confidence in our efficiency, for those beers. But to your point before, we really do we embrace the variability to a certain degree. farmhouse ales were kind of born out of that variability. What is there a bumper crop of it this year that we could throw into a beer, or year to year you're going to find that variation going back, over the time that these beers were made, and to have that kind of be woven into our approach has been part of it, and something we can translate then onto the consumer and manage their expectations that from batch to batch you might see some variability in this beer. We're going to try and steer it where we want it to go, but that's just part of farmhouse brewing.
Let's talk a little bit about grape beers. Obviously, given the family background, you've made a few of these so far, and you mentioned that you freeze the grapes, and then save them for another point in the year. What's your logic and reasoning behind that?
So part of it was just a logistical matter. We weren't ready to
Yeah,
brew that beer. We've always enjoyed freezing fruits. The
sure.
beer or the grapes are destemmed and crushed, but you're going to get a further maceration when you freeze and break apart those cell walls. And that was a little part of our thinking, and also maybe managing the bacterial load or any sort of wild yeast we might be introducing to things that could kind of throw it into weird directions. This year we're thinking about doing things a little bit differently. So the grapes that they grow down the road are this kind of hardy northern United States bred variety called St. Croix. Um, the knock on St. Croix being it can be quite acidic, um, and maybe a little sharp. When managed properly, we think it can do really nice things in our beer. Um, but the beer, when fresh, can kind of feel a bit like this lively, fruit beer, as opposed to, those mustier, deep wine qualities. And we think that we might be able to manage that a little bit by getting our fruiting out of the way sooner, and giving the beer maybe a secondary aging, whether it's in glass or going back into oak. All of our farmhouse ales are coming out of oak prior to fruiting or packaging at that point. So that's something, as we dive deeper down this road, we'll be playing with the timeline of when fruit is introduced and how it's handled. Um, but for now, that's part of it. And actually, we kind of stepped into it. A pretty knowledgeable uh, supplier from the area who sells wine supplies and great products across the country told us that we were getting this tannin extraction from the red grapes by having them in contact on the skins cold. That is like a softer tannin than you would have in the presence of like an alcoholic fermentation. So it was an unattended benefit, but he said he could see it in our beer, and it's something that's scientifically very real that's going on.
Interesting. You were accidentally using a winemaking technique that you weren't as familiar with, and
Yeah,
no, that's fantastic.
that
Uh,
happens in beer all the time, right? How much of the innovation that's been born out of the centuries has been just accidents. So yeah, we'll
sure.
take the little ones when they come our way.
What's the long term plan for Fox Farm look like? And are there any innovation or next developments or things you're excited about in the short run or in the long run?
Just day to day tweaks and improvements. I mean, that's where we really get our kicks, is just getting better every day. We don't have any visions beyond this place. We've for better or worse kind of woven it into our identity that this is where we make beer, and it's thus far been limited to our little building. But we did put up a new barrel barn. That's been our one big growth ambition, and probably the only practical growth ambition on this land, is to put up a purpose-built barrel storage space. So it's taken all of our mixed culture stuff and gotten it out of our main building, and given us the capacity to start investing in oak. And that's been the real tipping point. So final piece being, the spontaneous brewing program that we've always wanted to pursue. We've framed in our coolship in our upstairs, right above our brew house, but we just never had the space to brew more than 3 batches a year. It was definitely fun when our barrel storage space was so limited that that's all we could do, but we weren't hitting the scale necessary to iterate and improve. Um, we've found just over these past two brewing seasons where we've been able to ramp up to 10 plus batches, that's when we're getting the feedback that we need. And you have this crazy feedback loop, right? Of, 1, 2 years before
Right.
um, even where that beer is going, let alone what the final product's going to be. Um, when we were stuck doing 2 or 3 batches, we just weren't at the economies of scale needed to learn and grow as brewers. So we're finally there, and that's the final big piece that we're just extremely excited about.
I'm curious about that. I mean, obviously, since blending is such a key portion of this, and time and temperature, and when in a season something was brewed, and the kinds of temperature fluctuations, all of those things impact that kind of beer to a serious degree. And I think that's interesting. You're saying with only 2 or 3 brews in a season, there wasn't you couldn't learn the parameters and how to adjust for those kinds of things, or what you needed to tweak, or when you needed to brew, or what the kind of all of those pieces along the way that So what were some of the things that you found didn't work and that you moved away from, and what were some of the things that you found were really positive, that impacted some of the your future decision making?
Yeah, you're exactly right. We weren't putting enough colors on the palette either to pull from when eventually blending. We were you know just giving ourselves a very narrow window, and being our first couple seasons operating like that, we weren't going to hit that narrow window very well.
Right.
Maybe if we were brewing more, we'd have more stock to have blended from and would have had a product out by now. We're in our fourth year now, and um, I guess it'll be around our fifth anniversary maybe when this product makes out. So um, not
5
too
years of
bad.
brewing it before you finally release a spontaneous
Yeah,
beer.
you talk to the old guard who kind of cracked open the doors on spontaneous brewing in the U.S. It's not a bad timeline, but we definitely weren't doing ourselves any favors. And um, that's not to say though we weren't learning anything at that scale. We did make some nice mistakes that we were able to learn from, and kind of with that beer going down the drain, still kind of find something positive in it. And from a technical perspective, the big things being topping was number one. Um, we came into it thinking we could probably get away, and there's the two schools of thought on topping versus not, but we feel like we took the wrong approach by not topping, especially when we ended up moving those barrels out of our main brewery and into um, this little spray insulated shed that we had for our original barreled storage
Right.
space. That headspace was just killer. Um, Hopping
Too much
rates,
acetic acid production, or
it didn't go too acetic, but things could get really
yeah.
sharp at times. Yeah, and steering towards nail polish at times. Um, yes, acetic would definitely kind of show up, and but maybe we were just getting lucky with what we were capturing in the cool ship, where it wasn't necessarily acetic or acetobacter, but still things could get really sharp with that headspace. Um, and hopping rates also, definitely related to that. We had to bring up our hopping rates, and um, just a little scared introducing whole leaf aged hops in the quantities that you might try to if you're going to emulate a lambic producer, and having to get comfortable with that and finding some hacks to maybe get those hops into the hot side. We sparge really warm. We always sparge warm, but we took things even up further and introduced some of the whole leaf hops at Vorloff, actually, right prior to sparge, and we're going to get some isomerization at that temperature, and it keeps some of the whole leaf matter out of our kettle. So credit to one of our brewers, Dan, for bringing that into the folds and helping us get our hopping rates up in a practical way. Yeah, those
um
are the two big ones. I mean, we're,
yeah.
we're certainly playing with other variables, but we haven't found a big a wild variation in over the course of our season. Here in Connecticut, we can have these just crazy swings, um, and it can be really hard to build a brewing schedule and not have less than ideal conditions. Um, So sometimes we've had, a cool shit beer coming off a, 12-degree evening, and other times, 40-degree evening. And we've been really pleasantly surprised by the pace of fermentation, both, how it started, attenuation, how the beer tastes, even when it's gotten that cold, which has been great and given us the confidence this season to kind of just give it go ahead. I mean, coming up next week, I think we have one night that's going to hit like 10 degrees. That might scare us off, but for now, so far so good. Whether it's late fall or early spring, we're giving it a go.
Well, it sounds like you've got a lot of spontaneous beer stock back there, and I'm curious to taste it once it finally makes its way out into the world. But I think it's also a nice thing to brew it and not release it and not blend it and release it until you're truly happy with what the quality of that product really is. And I think that's probably a good place, to bring this to a close. G&D Chillers is the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling. Sativa is the latest in the BSG hop solution portfolio. Turns seltzer skeptics into supporters with real fruit from Old Orchard. Take full advantage of the enhanced marketing power of BreweryDB, and check the ABS Commercial Facebook page to find out how to enter to win a Keg Viking. Of course, if you'd like to support this very podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, and if you're a pro brewer, consider our new all-access pro subscriptions that combine both of the magazines, exclusive online content, and more. So, Zach, thanks for joining me on the podcast. If people want to learn more about Fox Farm, where do they find you guys?
Thanks so much for having me, Jamie. As I mentioned, we sell most of our beer online in this environment at foxfarmbeer.com. You can check us out and hopefully plan a visit sometime.
Well, it's a beautiful location. The beers that I've tasted have all been incredibly impressive, and it is a joy to drink your beer. I hope one day, as this COVID era passes, that I can come out and actually drink some in your tap room itself, and maybe try some of that straight and fresh off of the tap.
No, we can't wait.
Cool. Well, again, thanks for joining me on the podcast, Zach. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.